Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our Sunday school lesson, as we've said. This is a continuation of the Sunday school that we had at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. They got caught in the pandemic, and we just decided we'd move it over and do it here online and post it on YouTube so you could get to it at your leisure, at your convenience, what's best for you. And there'll be a record of it. That we've now progressed through the Old Testament to where we're covering the book of Ruth and the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. Remember, there's 2 Samuels, 1st and 2nd, 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd, 2 Chronicles, 1st and 2nd. So this will be Ruth and part of 1st Samuel. One of the listeners asked me a couple questions, and the one I think I'd like to answer is he was surprised that I said that I thought the pork prohibition for the Hebrews was really not a health one. I doubt that they really understood at the time it started of trichinosis, because they didn't believe in microbes and stuff like that. They believed in evil spirits. And that I thought the pork prohibition was to keep the Hebrews away from the Philistines. Philistines are from northern Mediterranean, like the Romans were. They were big pork eaters. Pork is easy to raise in confined spaces that doesn't take as much grazing room as cattle does. They were big pork eaters than the Philistines, and I think the prohibition was to keep the Hebrew people from going down and mingling with the Philistines and becoming contaminated by the Philistines and their various beliefs. So I've never read any definitive statement on that, but we have seen how other laws, like the law about not mixing milk and meat, was the descendant from a Hebrew Canaanite festival where they would cook an unborn lamb in its mother's milk, and that's where the meat and milk prohibition came in. So my opinion, which is an opinion, this is not fact. I know I say my opinions like they're facts, but they're just opinions, is that that's probably where the pork prohibition came from, to keep them separate from the Philistines. Philistines were very, very tough rivals for a long time. We'll start with Ruth first. And Ruth is a short 4-chapter, beautifully written book. And it's unique, fascinating, and like I said, beautiful. You cannot put a date on this. No one really knows when they wrote this. They wrote this sometime between the rule of late King David or Solomon on through the Babylonian exile or the later period. It's not clear. But sometime it came after King David. And it's written in the pattern of a romantic fiction where, and this is a tricky question, because does this story have to be true literally to be valid? And I would say no, not to me. It doesn't matter. It's making its point. And why couldn't God use literature to make God's point? I think fine, and so you don't have to prove everything actually happened the way it did to make your point. There's a very profound point here in this account. People think it really is stressing the romance, but I think that is part of it, and that's a very important part. But I think the fundamental lesson is a little bit different. But the review of the story, and this is set, quote, in the time of the judges. Now, I did not explain the translation of the term judge previously last week, as I should have, my mistake. The Hebrew term is shofet, S-H-O-F-E-T, if you put it into English. And it means judge, but it also means leader. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the modern conception of a judge here in the U.S., where a judge is in a robe and sits in court and bangs the gavel and all that. But a judge could be a leader. And actually in Texas, the term judge can apply to a court-sitting judge and also to the county administrator, called judges in various counties in Texas. So it is a term that we use a little bit here in the U.S. in that way. So it really meant leader. And of course, the judges were leaders that were chosen by God, given the divine charismatic gift to allow them to rise to the occasion and take command of the situation when there was a crisis. So we'll talk about Samuel when we get there. So it says in the time of the judges, and it relates that there's a famine in the Israelite or Hebrew land, and a Hebrew man and his wife. The wife is Naomi, and his 2 sons. They have names, but we don't need to go into the names. Leave the highlands of what's now the West Bank, which was the highlands of Israel, and cross the Jordan and go into Moab. Moab is the area directly east. If you go through the fords near Jericho, that's where you would cross, and that's Moab, up on the plains of what's now Jordan. And the story is that they went there because of the famine in their homeland. And the 2 sons, there was the father, 2 sons, and the wife, Naomi being the wife of the father. The 2 sons both marry local Moabite women. And then the husband dies and the 2 sons die, and Naomi is left behind with the 2 daughters-in-law. And she tells them, because she's got no way to care for them. Remember, women couldn't have property, as far as we know, in those days. They really didn't own independent property and businesses at that time. And so she tells the daughters-in-law, go back to your own people. And one of them does. There's tears and hugs and kisses and bids her fond farewell. And Ruth says no. And it's beautifully written, even in translations. I'll read it right from the text. And Ruth says to her, do not press me to leave you and to stop going with you, for wherever you go, I shall go. Wherever you live, I shall live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. When you die, I shall die, and there I shall be buried. Let the Lord bring unmanageable ills on me, worse ills too, if anything but death should part me from you. So it's a very interesting dedication between the daughter-in-law, who is a foreign rival tribe. They're actually cousin tribes. They're ethnically the same stock, and her mother-in-law. And so eventually, because the men are gone, they have to go back to Bethlehem, which is where she's from. And they're poor, basically beggar-type women, and they're allowed in that custom to glean the fields. And that comes when the harvesters have gone through and they pick up, it says corn in the translation, but it's not corn. This is wheat or rye or barley, one of the cereal grains. Corn, of course, is a New World crop from Central and South America, so they didn't have it there. So they had wheat or rye or barley, and they would harvest it, and some small amounts would always fall behind and be left behind by the harvesters, and the poor were allowed to come and glean, to pick up the residue and live off that. It's a tough way to live. So they're out there gleaning, and Ruth is noticed by the wealthy. This person is a kinsman of Naomi, the mother-in-law, because she went back to her hometown. They're all related in towns like that. And he notices her and appears to be taken with her. So he tells her, don't go to any other fields. You just come and glean our fields. You can get right in behind my reapers. And he tells the reapers, be a little casual, let some more drop so she can have it, and tells everybody to leave her alone. And so he does these things, and she's able to bring home significant amounts more, and he gives her extra grain and bread for her well-being. He tells her she can drink from their water supply, etc. So she's very pleased. She goes back to Naomi. Naomi tells her, hey, what you need to do tonight is get yourself cleaned up, wear your best clothes, perfume yourself, and then after he is asleep, go and sleep at the foot of his bed. And what she's doing by doing that is offering herself in marriage to Boaz. And so he eats his meal and drinks his fill and goes to sleep and wakes up late at night, and there's this woman sleeping down at his feet, and he's a little startled and all that. And he figures out who she is, and it's clear what she's saying, she's offering herself in marriage. Now, remember that it was not good for young women to be unmarried in this world. Men controlled everything. And so she's offering herself, but it's a little bit tricky with what's called the right of redemption. And I don't understand it completely, but it was the old custom that if a brother died, then his brother would be obligated to take in the widow and the children, even if there were children. But with that, you would get the inheritance. So Boaz is not next in line. He's kind of the second. Excuse me a second here. I'm choking up. My allergies, forgive me. And so they go to the closest relative, and they talk about the right of redemption, which I think, and this is a tricky one to explain, is that if that person who was the closest brother to the deceased father-in-law wants to claim her as another wife, you can have multiple wives in those days, don't forget, and get the inheritance, then if they have any children, that inheritance should go to their children, not into his family directly, but into their children. But he can claim the property otherwise without taking the wife. And so he doesn't want the wife, he wants the property. Okay, Boaz wants the wife, and he's got enough property to worry about that. So they have a little bit of a ceremony, and Boaz claims his right of redemption. He's next behind this other person, and marries Ruth, and they kind of live happily ever after. But the interesting wrinkle is that she is the grandmother of King David. So I think that's the major point here, that the greatest of the Israelite kings, King David, a lover of the Lord, he had his own faults, we'll talk about them later, great warrior, great king, lover of the Lord, that his grandmother was a foreign lady. And I think the point of this, whenever it was written, and I bet it was written a lot later, is to attack this ethnic hostility that was rampant in the Middle East at that time, that is rampant in the Middle East right now, that is rampant all over the world, and a big problem here in the United States. So I think what it really was, and it really should speak to us now, that you really shouldn't dislike people, hate people, reject people because of their ethnicity. So I think that's the main point of the story, and I bet it was written a lot later, like about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they had all these ethnic tensions when they got back to rebuild Jerusalem. But that's just a guess. Nobody has any idea other than a guess. So if I'm wrong, okay, I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again, but that's the way I read it. But it's a lovely story. It's beautiful. People write books about it, and there's going to they teach classes on it and all this. But I think it's really a story about to not have ethnic hostility, because that's just hating people for the sake of hatred. And we move on into the first part of 1 Samuel, and this sets the stage. Now Samuel emerges as the last of the judges, the Shofet, that mix of charismatically ordained leader. And it's the first time I can remember the word prophet being used about him. He becomes a prophet also. And as you transition from these erratic, charismatic leaders into the monarchy, then the prophets become more appropriate and more prominent, because they are calling the culture or the king to account for their misbehavior or their foolishness or whatever. And Samuel kind of allows that transition. His mother was barren, had not had any children, which was in those days regarded as a divine curse almost. So she prays to God, and if I have a son, I'll dedicate him to you. And so she gets pregnant. She has a child whom she names Samuel. And when he's weaned, she takes him to the main temple at Shiloh now, which is where the Ark of the Covenant is being kept. If you remember last week, the Abimelech, the bad guy who tried to become king and got himself killed by a woman, that's a good way to put it, isn't it? And he had destroyed Shechem, which was the traditional religious site where the tribes would gather annual for their Yahweh covenant ceremonies. And so that had been destroyed and never rebuilt. And so the sacred site where the ark was had been moved east a little bit to Shiloh, which means place of peace. If you're familiar with American history, there's an ironic name of a huge Civil War battle. It's called Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee. Enormous slaughter. What an irony to name it after a Hebrew word that means place of peace. So he's taken there, and he's a youngster, a child, And he's sleeping, and 3 times he's awoken by a voice calling him, Samuel, Samuel. And each time he goes in, he goes back to Eli. Eli is the head priest at that area who's in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. And he had agreed to take Samuel in. And finally, Eli says, I'm not calling you those 3 times. This is God talking to you. So the next time it happens, talk to him and see what he wants. So I'm kind of putting it in the vernacular here. So the next time it happens, he does, and God speaks to him and says that, I'm going to use you as a great leader, that Eli has been a disappointment and his sons are scoundrels. It's a good word. It's actually an excellent word in my translation. I don't know what's in other translations, to describe these evil sons that take advantage of their father's situation. They're scoundrels and they're all going to die, and you will be the leader to emerge to lead your people. Again, becoming the judge, the shofet, and God's selection. And he kind of goes, oh. And Eli bugs him to tell me what's going to happen, and finally he tells him, and Eli goes, So there's, later than that, there's the Philistines are attacking. As I said last week, the Philistines were really tough opponents. They had been professional Greek fighters, warriors by profession. They had settled in what's now the Gaza Strip, an area along there. They had iron, and the Hebrews didn't have iron. Hebrews just had bronze. Better weaponry, iron chariots and all that. And they were tough opponents. They're trying to drive into the hill country and take over the Israelites. So it's a big battle. The Israelites get beat. So they retreat, and they think, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant onto the battlefield, like we had with Moses. Excuse me here, I'm sorry. And God will give us victory. So it's a big shout, celebration when they bring the Ark in from Shiloh. And Eli's 2 sons go along with it, and they go to fight the Philistines, and they get wiped out. Eli's sons get killed, the Philistines drive them away in defeat, and they capture the Ark of the Covenant. So one of the survivors goes back to Shiloh and tells Eli, and he falls over backward, breaks his neck, and dies. That'll do it. If you break your neck in that era, that'll do it. And so the Ark is in the possession of the Philistines. A very interesting story. Because they think, oh, here's this war trophy. Remember, capturing war trophies in those days was a big deal. It's still a deal now, I suspect, in certain wars. You capture enemy flags and things like that. And so they take it to one of their cities. There's 5. You're on my notepad there. My cat was sitting on my notepad, I'm sorry. There were 5 Philistine cities, which are along the Gaza Strip, is Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. And so they bring it and put it in one of the cities in their sacred tent next to their own graven image god. I think their god was called Dagon. And the next morning they come back in, and the Ark is still sitting there, and the Dagon god has fallen over on its face. So they put it back up. The next night, the same thing happens, except the arms get broken off. It falls over again. Then they think, hey, this is bad news. This God in this, remember, they believed in multiple gods in those days. This God is bad news for us. Let's dump it on our neighbor city. They start passing it among the 5 Philistine cities. But you got a real problem if you, typical humans, well, let's dump it on our neighbors. So they send it to the next neighbor. And the next one, they continue to have problems. And then one of the final things sounds like, from the description, and this is, going back, and once a doctor, always a doctor, it sounds like a bubonic plague epidemic, that they have rats everywhere, and they talk about tumors. Now, the buboes from bubonic plague, there are 2 variants. One is the skin manifestation, which are the buboes, these tumors full of the bacteria. And the other is the pneumonic version, where it's just in your respiratory system. But it sounds like, you read this, that this is the bubonic plague. And let me tell you, bubonic plague will kill you quickly now. And even those days where you had no defense, it wiped out 1/3 of Europe in the Black Death, a couple thousand years later. So they decide to get rid of this thing. So they make up golden symbols of buboes and rats. They put the Ark in a cart with a couple oxen, and the oxen just walk it up into the Hebrew area. Don't even have to guide it. And they're thinking, most likely, good riddance. Let's be done with this thing. This is nothing but trouble. Samuel finds the cart, does the sacrifice of the oxen, chops up the cart, uses that for the firewood, and restores the ark to Shiloh. And then he becomes the shofet, the leader, the judge, and the prophet for the people. And so that takes us through this area to the end of that section. And reading the next section is 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 15. And this is, we have King Saul, the tragic king, because he's, to me, a very sympathetic figure in the Old Testament, because he gets the divine charisma, and then God takes it away, and he's miserable. And so I feel a lot of sympathy for this guy, but he becomes an evil and unstable king. So that's what we'll be dealing with next. 1 Samuel 8 through 15, Saul the tragic king. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.